So I think we're here to discuss what some may call the pleasure principle, and the fact that India is a civilization that is actually rooted in this sort of imagined pleasure principle that over the decades and over the centuries, in a way got repressed. That is a very simple one-line summation of the book, but there's much more in it: mythology, culture, history, religion, politics, all of it. And before I talk to the rest of the panel, Gurcharan, we live in times when the issue of individual rights are perhaps more contested than ever before. Who you can love, have sex with, what you can eat, what you can drink. These are things that no less than the Supreme Court today is adjudicating on, where the right to personal liberty is being spoken about. We are a society which is being codified to think of the collective rather than the I. Where does desire fit into that? Because it is such a deeply personal and individual sentiment. Why this book, and why this book today?
Well, Barka, the emotional life of a country is just as important as its political life, as its economic life. And we've tended to brush the emotional life under the carpet. And that's why we continue to live with repression, patriarchic stereotypes. Fortunately, the younger generation, I think, the younger generation that was unbound by India Unbound, that generation is changing. But it really does fit in very well into the, as Nehru just explained, that this is the third volume in a trilogy. I hadn't originally thought of it that way. But actually, India Unbound was Artha, and the difficulty of being good was Dharma. And so it's a logical thing. And Anandavardhana, the 9th century critic, on whose advice I wrote the book, happens to be a close friend. He says that a good book should deal with one aim of life. So the beginning point really is that all of us want to be happy, we want to live flourishing lives. And I always believed, ever since I read that one-liner of Freud, that the answer to happiness was to love the work you do and love the person you live with. But the classical Indian, ancient Indian sages had another answer, and that was the answer that what they called beginning with the Rig Veda, by the way, that the notion of the Three Varga, which was actually in a sense a trilogy, that you have the Artha, meaning material well-being, Dharma, moral well-being, Kama, emotional well-being, and then, of course, about 700 years later in the Upanishads came Moksha, which is spiritual well-being. That if these goals of life are in equilibrium, are in harmony, are in equipoise, that's the secret of the flourishing life.
Now, of course, you make desire sound so simple, and it almost never is. It can also be the source of great unhappiness and angst, but we'll get to that in the course of the conversation. I think what's interesting for the audience to know is that this is a fictional memoir. In other words, it's really your story told through a character. And you talk about this
Not
kind
my
of...
story.
Well,
Fictional, that's the word fictional.
And memoir, that's the second word.
Yeah.
But this interesting
So Amar is not me, please.
Okay, we'll allow you that cover for now. But this conflict that many upper middle class Indians, by virtue of their education, I think all of us on this stage, as you mentioned, that conflict between a Christian missionaries driven education, school and college,
Yes.
and then a ganja smoking Pandit ji of your grandmother's who surfaces at one point.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that and who really taught you more.
Well, that was it. I mean, it so happened that I'm talking about Amar now. Let's not forget. And it so happens that
Gurcharan Amar hai.
It so happened that for many of us, when we were growing up, there was a certain, modernity meant my mother or Amar's mother, Shashi's mother, they wanted us to have an English education. But there was somebody in the family who was saying that, my God, these people are losing touch with their roots. The difference here was that I got two very different kinds of education. I'm speaking on behalf of Amar.
You don't have to keep clarifying.
Because, the problem is that the book is written in the first person. So it's always I. And what I want to make sure you don't think it's me. That's why I keep clarifying. Anyway, just to give you an example of how the story works. First of all, it has to be a story because you can't talk about desire and love in the context of an abstract philosophical essay. You really have to tell a story. So I had to create a story. And that's why the story exists, and about 40, 50, but half and half. Half the book is the story, and half the book is this narrator who's trying to come to grips with what's going on. So when he's feeling jealous, Anyway, so to give you a flavor of how I go about this, in the very first scene, the narrator is remembering his first memory of desire. And it's a cold morning, it's dawn, he wakes up and feels cold and runs to his mother's bed, jumps in, nestles beside her, and falls blissfully asleep. And then the old narrator, the older man who's telling the story, takes over. And he says, desire strikes early in life. But it can also strike early in a civilization. So, unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition, where in the beginning was light, God said, let there be light, in Genesis. In the Rig Veda, in the beginning was desire, and the cosmos was created from the seed of desire in the mind of the one. So then he asks this question, what does it say about a civilization where in the beginning was desire? And that really kind of begins the story, lays the thing, because now the reader knows what to expect here in this book.
So let me get in the others at this point. Shashi, when you read this book, it would suggest that India has always had this sort of, civilizationally, India has had this celebratory relationship with desire. That desire is elevated, as Gurcharan said, to a civilizational principle. But when you look at more closely at, let's say, modern India and how it was born, one of the earliest things that all of us read about Gandhi, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, was his struggle with notions of desire, with almost seeing desire as this sort of, sinful thing. His politics wrestling with it, his memory of his father's death wrestling with, a sinful memory of desire. So, if what Gurcharan says is true, how did modern India and its founders come to have such a different relationship with the desire principle?
Well, apparently, if you read Gurcharan's book, it's not only modern India, that even in the ancient texts, there is a struggle between what he broadly classifies as the karma optimists and the karma pessimists. So that there are, in the ancient texts, those who see desire as a source of evil, as a danger, as something that needs to be controlled, even suppressed, versus those who argue, of course, that it is the fount of all action, of creation, of procreation, and therefore should be encouraged and indulged. And I think that this tension has been there in every society. You see it in the Western world, and you certainly, I think you mentioned the Irish missionary character, who clearly sees sin in terms, desire in terms of eternal sin, and wants to suppress it.
Original sin.
Original sin.
But so does Mahatma Gandhi.
And so does
yeah.
But Mahatma Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi got this obsession from Tolstoy. I mean, Tolstoy was a nasty man who, the way he behaved with his wife, you know, you have to read the Kreutzer Sonata.
Well, the same thing is said about how Gandhi behaved with his.
Well, I mean, the thing is that
Gandhi, Tolstoy for the way Gandhi.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, the influence that Tolstoy had of Gandhi, but please, I'm sorry.
No, you make that point well, I think it's there, it's worth stressing.
So, between the karma optimist and the karma pessimist...
So Jawaharlal Nehru was the karma optimist and Mahatma Gandhi was the karma pessimist?
No, not quite. I mean, I don't...
Nehru Memorial seems appropriate to say.
Yeah, well, it does. But the interesting thing is, I think Nehru could have been a karma optimist, actually. But there was this grand compromise that took place in history between the struggle between the karma optimists, who wrote the Kama Sutra, who wrote Sanskrit love poetry, and created this wonderful tradition, and the karma pessimists, who were the renouncers, and the biggest ones were the Jains and the Buddha, actually. And so this compromise was what I call the karma realists. And the karma realists basically said that sex is okay as long as it's within marriage. Now, I think all societies went through that sort of agreement. And therefore, the karma realists are the ones who actually then wrote this down in the dharma text.
But let me just get you to complete your point. This sort of British codification of our society, as it were, a lot of what we believe today to be modern, what we believe to be fair-minded, and I'm coming to you in a second. Gurcharan would actually argue are ideas that are almost imported, and it's interesting that this is a different kind of nativism. Nativism today, as we understand it, takes us in to other places where you're told 377 should be upheld or nobody takes a position in it, the present company excluded. But really, is there a tussle here between what the notion of modernity came to be, and in that pursuit of modernity, somewhere did we become less free?
Yeah, I think we did, but if I can just take it back a little bit to what Gurcharan just talked about. Sublimating karma in marriage was part of it, but there was also the transmutation of desire as expression of longing for the Lord. I think Gurcharan could have made more of the bhakti movement, where there's a lot of verses going back centuries in which desire for the Lord is expressed in extremely physical ways. You know the Gita Govind and how the desire that Jayadev expresses that Radha feels for Krishna is very much part of the one time meant to be understood as yearning for the divine, and the other side described in very fleshy terms. It's quite startling to read and understand.
Yeah.
So there was always, if you like, the ways of accommodating to desire. Now then the Brits come along. I mean, arguably in northern India there was also the complication of the Muslim invasions, which did introduce a certain amount of cloistering and parda and all of that. But when the British come along, they have reached their military and political peak at the time of their Victorian prudery being at its peak. You know, a time when the legs of pianos had to be covered because they were legs, right? And ankles were not meant to be seen. And those were the values that were imposed upon us, including in the Indian Penal Code. You mentioned Section 377. And in the process internalized. Unfortunately, in the colonial era, we were rather good subjects. And we kind of took on board many of the prejudices that had not hitherto been overtly expressed in Indian society. So what we are today, in terms of prudery, in terms of resistance to all of this, is very much a legacy of all these experiences. And undoubtedly, for example, the Brits outgrew their own prohibitions, the ones they imposed on us. They outgrew them for themselves before we did.
Yeah.
And look at our film censorship board, look at our, two birds pecking instead of a kiss and all of that stuff as late as the 60s and 70s when the rest of the world was going through a sexual revolution. So we've taken a longer time to come to terms with it. In some ways, the book, if you see it as part of a trilogy for Gurcharan, has interesting affinities in different ways with the other two books, because the thing about the book that's most reminiscent of The Difficulty of Being Good is the close reading of ancient texts, extensive citations and translations and verses and so on. But the interesting thing it has in common with India Unbound, where no ancient text is mentioned, is actually the sense of liberation, the need to lift off the shackles we've imposed upon ourselves. There economically, here sexually.
William, I think there are two strains in this book. One is, of course, this sort of conflict between the civilizational history of India, as the character in the book, not Gurcharan, Amar tells it, and the gap that he sees between the Judeo-Christian sort of exposure and roots of his education and his own sort of native, I use that word carefully in today's times, native history. And then there is this sort of colonial hangover, right? But somewhere I feel this has all become like somewhat of an excuse that today we want to, it's so fashionable to say we were civilizationally so free. Where is the evidence of that in contemporary society? Is it all too convenient to say, hey, the Brits left us this?
Where I would take issue is the idea that there is a Judeo-Christian tradition. There are two very different traditions, the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, in this matter. If you look at the Old Testament, if you look at the Song of Songs, richly erotic poetry that is the equal of the Gita Govind, and this huge enjoyment of sex and sensuality and the pleasure of the human body and beauty, and ditto in the Old Testament in the Book of Kings with David chasing after the wife of Uriah the Hittite and this sort of thing. There is a very strong pro-sex attitude in Judaism, which passes on to Islam. And in Islam, again, it's constrained within marriage, but again, there is a generally positive attitude to sex within Islam. So when you get the Islamic period here in India, you find that there is an instant adaptation in an Indo-Islamic, in this classic way that happens with so many spheres of life. So today, because I think originally because of Richard Burton's translation, we all know the Kama Sutra, but there are many texts on sensuality from ancient India, and that you get a spectacular sort of encyclopedic collection of not just the Kama Sutra but many other lost texts in various Islamic manuals like the Lazat al-Nisa, the pleasures of women, which are pulled together in Delhi and in particularly Hyderabad in the 18th century. In the 18th century you get this incredible flourishing of sensual, particularly in Delhi, but then emanating from that to Lucknow, to Hyderabad, and to other places like that, you get this huge output of erotic poetry, of erotic sculpture, painting, and Islam indigenizes this, in India, it indigenizes this Hindu tradition and brings it and codifies it in the same way that you have this interest of Akbar in the Upanishads. You have a whole range of far less high-minded other Islamic rulers who want to get their hands on the manuals, and by the time you get to 18th century Hyderabad, you've got huge subsections of libraries dedicated to this. So, for example, you get the Ittara Shahi, which is this book on sex and scent. And today you might be lucky if your boyfriend produces a scented candle before pulling you into their bedroom. But in the Ittara Shahi, there's this elaborate 20-page description of different ways of scenting a room, how to impregnate a bed sheet with sandal, which produce 3 layers of scent in a bedroom that is ready for seduction. One on the floor level, one on the bed level, and one on the kneeling on the bed level. It's a highly sophisticated and intensely codified history. And against that, you get a totally different Christian tradition. And Christianity, which becomes a world religion, or becomes a widespread Mediterranean-wide religion, and then in the breakup of the Roman Empire, the time of Constantine, when there is this massive reaction against sensuality of the High Roman period. And the result is the writings of Augustine, which you mentioned and talk about very interestingly in this book, but many other equally sort of ascetic and anti-sex writing. And there's libraries, there's one that anyone's interested in this, there's a fantastic book on this and how Christianity turned a very central Jewish tradition into something that was anti-body, anti-sex, that religion meant the flagellation of the body, the punishment of the flesh, by a wonderful writer called Peter Brown, called The Body and Society. And he describes how throughout the Roman Empire, for example, bathhouses got closed down, which is why in the West you have no bathhouses in the Middle Ages, but they survive in the Islamic world, and so on. And anything that was connected with the body is punished and is regarded as sinful. And I think, bring it round to Gandhi, I think Gandhi is far more influenced by Christianity than people often realize in this country. That much of the ideas of ahimsa come, in fact, from his own readings of Christianity. I would say, you could disagree with this and Buddhism, but he also takes in, sadly, the Christian hang-ups of the body, this idea of needing to punish the body, that the body is something sinful. And therefore losing what I think is one of the great gifts of Indian civilization, which is this appreciation of one of the greatest things that we are. Ultimately, scientifically, we're here to pass on our DNA. That's our job, and wrestle with it as we like in different societies and civilizations. But that's the primary urge, which doesn't just involve, of course, procreation. It also involves nurturing and the family and everything else. But India has been more in tune with that fundamental biological urge, and Indian civilization has celebrated and raised it far more.
But then
than any other civilization.
how do you explain that many predominantly Christian countries did, as Shashi mentioned, manage to re-evolve, right?
After the Enlightenment, after the Christianity begins to be shed from public
But
life.
Indian society did get codified in a way.
Sadly, you as Shashi says, you get this early phase, which I write about in White Moguls, obviously, when the early 18th century Brits do embrace this aspect of India, and 1/3 of all company men are leaving things to Indian women and Anglo-Indian children in their wills at around 1750 to about 1800, but that's over by 1830. And the high phase of Victorian colonialism is this joyless evangelical utilitarian. You got colonized by the wrong people at the wrong time. I shouldn't say this in front of Shashi to encourage him, but.
Okay, let me bring Alka in, and then I think Gurcharan wanted to say something. One thing that the character in the book also says is this is quite literally the male gaze. This is desire as seen by a man. But there's an interesting, sort of passage on the contrast between Sita and Radha, and Janmashtami is an appropriate time to actually talk a little bit about this. But Sita is the austere, married, sacrificial, sort of to be worshipped woman, and Radha is the much more mischievous, in touch perhaps with her own desire and dreams, and sort of frolicky and a bit naughty and all of that. And yet this is a society that sort of regards both. But today would expect women to be more like Sita than Radha. Today we would, right? Or maybe not. I don't know. Go ahead with what.
That's a very complex question.
I know. Sorry.
But first, let me just begin by complimenting Gurcharan on taking on this whole question of karma, because this is very much part of the wellness of society, as you say, very important for any civilization to grow and prosper, and the way he looks at the riddle. Now, just that point, and I'll come to Sita and Radha immediately. The point is, for me, it's very clear that there is no riddle. Karma is a deeply immersive experience, and yes, there is a male gaze, because the Kama Sutra itself is actually a compendium. It's been all written or collected by the 7 sages, whether it's Gonikaputra or Charayana, collected by Vatsayan. So definitely there is a male gaze, but having said that, in the time in which it was written, which was very much pre-modern India, I think there was a lot of gender parity, because in the Kama Sutra it says very clearly that the pleasure of the woman is as important as that of a male.
First, give her pleasure.
Yeah. So the point is, when we come to Sita or Radha, I'm going back to the itihasa tradition of India, because we don't have a historical narrative really, because our tradition is of itihas. It is of storytelling, of narrative. So when you are talking of Sita or Radha, who's Radha and who's Sita are you talking of? Because within the Indian context, Valmiki ki Ramayana hai, Tulsi ki Ramayana hai, ye meri Ramayana hai. So there is everybody's Ramayana. So the interpretation of Sita is who's Sita. In the same way, today's Janamashtami, 18th September is Radha-ashtami. So who is more, we can't really say, because it is the Itihasic tradition and it is deeply interpreted. Because on Radha-ashtami, it is Radhe Radhe and it is Radha Shakti. In the same way as Gurcharan mentions time and again Shiva Shakti or Shiva and Parvati. Or if you look at Raghuvansh, where the opening line, bowing down to Ardhanarishwar, Jagatapitaru Vande, Sita, Jagatapitaru Vande, Shiva Parvati, Namaste. So what is that? They are the primordial parents and they are absolutely equal. Shiva without his Shakti is Shava. So Sita, when she kind of rejects Ram and goes and immerses herself, that's what it is. So I don't really know, because in today's time when you are talking of what the women want, I think there is again, there I will say there is a great riddle, because the women really today, this is my very subjective opinion, and as Gurcharan mentioned in his article in the morning, we have to re-look at everything through contemporary lens. We have to understand in which context was Sita, in which context was Radha. It is very easy to just give, just give juxtapositions or give opinions. These are very complex characters and everybody interprets them in a different way. The Shaivites or Shakt, people who believe in Shakti, they will interpret Sita and Radha in a completely different way. So tomorrow when you see many images of Radha where she is wearing the crown and wearing Krishna's clothes, and as Gurcharan himself has written in the book, the woman on top really. So what does it show? So who is the male and who is the female? So sexuality is very transient. It's very fluid. So Radha can be more powerful at some point and Krishna is her slave. That's what Jayadev does in the Geet Govind. So it depends. What do you want to derive from this? What is the reading you want to take from that? And I think today's woman is a very empowered woman. She decides what she wants to do. And if she is wise, she's inclusive.
So I want to just take this discussion from this cosmic, historical, cultural sphere to really give the audience a flavor of how I go about and what really is happening in the book. And so there is a situation where the narrator, he's now in his 40s. He's now in his 40s. He spent his years climbing corporate ladders. He's spent years bringing up children with his wife. He loves his wife. But the desire has gone out of the marriage. Desire in the sort of sense of the first. By the way, I should stop the story here for a minute and tell you, these flowers on the cover of the book are really the 5 stages of love. These flowers are the god Kama has a bow made of sugarcane. The string is made of honeybees, and he shoots these flowers at his victims So at the first stage of love, which is fascination, with you see the other person, and so he shoots that first one. Of course, he shoots it at Shiva, and that gets him into trouble, because Parvati has been wanting him to do it. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that so this fellow, Amar, he is now suddenly meets on the Deccan Queen to Pune this very beautiful woman, and he, by the way, looks a bit like Catherine Deneuve. I've always thought Catherine Deneuve.
But Amma is not Gurcharan.
I'm not Amar, but I'm the writer, so I can make Amar. So Amar, without really intending to, he falls in love with her and she with him, and it's very clear that they might have an affair. And so he agonizes about this because he's very happy in his home, in his family. He loves his wife. And yet the thrill of this middle-aged affair is something that he faces. So he thinks, what should I do? And so he puts in his mind the pros and cons. So first he thinks why he shouldn't have an affair. And the reason is that, my God, my marriage will be destroyed. My wife will be devastated. And then he says, my children, that's the second reason. It'll do a lot of damage to the children. But then he says, well, those wretched children are going to go away when they grow up. And then he thinks, well, maybe I should I, if I ignore the children, they'll never forgive me. But maybe we could keep it secret. And then he says, well, if we keep it secret, then I'll have to lie. And then lies will be piled upon lies. And lies, more and more lies, and I will become an inauthentic human being. So then he says, maybe I shouldn't have an affair. But then, if I don't have an affair, this affair, I will forever resent the fact that I had this great chance for happiness that I did not take advantage of. And that maybe I'll end up as a shriveled, mean, old man who did not do at that moment what he should have. So this in classical Indian terms is the conflict between karma and dharma. That dharma is a duty. We are always reminded about dharma. Dharma is a duty to others. But for the first time, I think I've realized that karma is a duty to oneself. And we have a duty to ourselves. And so, if we think about all this, really, the fact of the matter is, there is no answer. It's what businessmen would call lose-lose. In other words, no win-win. This is, and in fact, this is the melancholic human condition, as the Mahabharata actually uses these very words. The melancholic karma leads to the melancholic human condition. And so, as the book unfolds, and I'm not going to tell you what he decides to do, but as the book unfolds, the realization, what Amar learns from this is really that these stages of life, represented by these lotuses, this jasmine flower, the ashoka flower, and the last, by the way, is the sandalwood flower, which is actually called Maran, the last stage. That although desire of a certain kind may die, but desire changes. In other words, that wisdom lies in coming to understand that desire changes with every decade, every stage of life, and that what you had in the first few weeks of your honeymoon is quite different. And there is, and in fact, this is, frankly, this is the lesson. The relationship between Pierre and Natasha in War and Peace is very different from Pierre and Bolkonsky. I mean, Bolkonsky and Natasha. So the fact is that I've just lost a very important reference that I was about to make. But the point here is that wisdom lies in recognizing that we have different stages of life, and it takes inner resources to make each one a creative stage of life. And yes, Tolstoy's family happiness. We all know Anna Karenina and how she throws herself before the train. But most of us haven't read Family Happiness, which is a short novel. And that, I think, is one of his wisest novels. And I wish Gandhi had read that rather than the Kreutzer Sonata, which is, of course, a terrible story.
Okay, so Alka mentioned putting a contemporary lens on some of these conversations. And Gurcharan, the moment you do that, actually a lot of these assumptions don't hold, right? If we see society as we recognize it today, we see society in the way that it's evolved, Shashi. I mean, you can make a limited argument that, the court will strike down 377 or parts of it and decriminalize homosexuality, but that's just one battle of, in a sense, freedom. But in every other way, society in India has got more codified.
Absolutely.
Right? More conservative. I actually think that there was some reference to, younger people. I think a lot of surveys shows that young people are more conservative, believe much more in old institutions and norms without questioning.
Well, I don't know about that, but I would say that they have a much tougher time being free in an India in which you actually have a chief minister proclaiming Romeo squads, right, that go around actually policing young couples canoodling in parks and bus stops and arrest them. I've written an article, I don't remember anymore the exact number, but it's some frightening official statistic released by the government. Something like 13,200 couples arrested by these actually anti-Romeo squads that have been unleashed on them. Valentine's Day. I mean, there are many places in India where young couples out on Valentine's Day are openly harassed, where shops selling Valentine's Day cards are vandalized, where candlelit dinners on Valentine's Day evening. We should probably just rename it Kamadeva Divas.